Hello and welcome. Before jumping into the course, let's get a brief overview. The course material that I'm presenting here is based largely upon a book that has been written by Dr. Daniel Kaplan. The name of the book is Lessons in Statistical Thinking. The book is available for free on the web and you will find it here at this link. I've got the permission of Dr. Kaplan to include material from the book in my slides. So let's get started. Although one of the primary goals of modern education is to develop in students the ability to think critically, unfortunately, modern education doesn't seem to do a good job of communicating to people what critical thinking is all about. Quite often, just using some mathematics is sufficient to give a label of critical thinking to something. Well, that's not enough. So one of the first things in critical thinking, or one of the basic things in critical thinking, is that people should have the ability to construct arguments which are reasonable, arguments which are sound. Okay, so of course, to do that, they need to even understand what are sound arguments and what arguments are not sound arguments. Okay, so not only do we need the ability to construct sound, believable arguments, we also need to have the ability to evaluate arguments that other people make and determine whether those arguments are sound or not. Okay, so that's a whole foundation that is built of critical thinking. Okay, the second point, of course, is in the process of constructing sound arguments, we have to be using correct logic, correct rules of induction and deduction, right? Very often what happens is people make an argument, it sounds very convincing, but it actually has lots of gaping holes in it. And we don't identify those holes simply because we are not trained in the habit of evaluating arguments critically. So that's again a part of making the argument, but applying correct reasoning is a very critical aspect of critical thinking. A third important aspect is, of course, to be able to examine the evidence. Because after all, when you make an argument, you're basing your argument on some evidence that you're presenting. So when you make an argument, you should be able to present correct evidence. And when others make an argument, you should have the ability to evaluate the evidence and see if that evidence is actually correct or meaningful for the argument that's being made. Okay, and of course, when we are talking about statistics, we are really talking about this evidence. In statistics, the evidence that we present when we come to our conclusions, that evidence is data and what conclusions we come to from that data. And finally, of course, you see a phenomenon and you say, okay, this happened because of X. You come to a certain conclusion, but it's completely possible that there are alternate explanations for the same observation, right? So we should be able to evaluate alternate explanations of phenomena as well, right? So at the very minimum, you can say that these things that are presented on this slide are sort of the minimal elements of critical thinking. And of course, when it comes to statistics, when you're talking about evidence-based decisions and when you're talking about conclusions that you arrive at based on evidence, so this whole area, statistical thinking, forms a very important subset of critical thinking, especially making evidence-based decisions. Okay, so let's look at some of the features that are part of statistical thinking that we look at in this course. Okay, first of all, a critical aspect of statistics is variation. I won't get into much detail right now because the rest of the course is really going to be talking on and on about variation. Okay, so that's an important theme in statistics. After all, we see variation in the real world, right? When we see people with differing heights. When we see companies that are of different sizes and companies that make different products and companies have different profits. There's a lot of variation that you see in the world when it comes to uh, real world phenomena. Statistics is all about understanding the variation, right? Or even specifically explaining the variation, right? Why is it that people have different heights, right? So we want to explain that in terms of other aspects. Okay, so that's a central theme and central goal of statistics, which is study of variation and explanation of variation. And when we are talking about statistics, we'll be looking at data in a certain specific way, especially data represented in the form of what we call as a data frame. Okay, tabular data, but with certain specific properties that qualify it as a meaningful data frame for the purpose of analysis. And of course, we have the concept of a variable. In fact, a data frame is made up of variables. Again, I'm not going to get into any depth at this point because the very next lecture is going to be all about data frames. Then, of course, in statistics, we are concerned with patterns most of all, right? That is, when you have data, what we are really trying to do is to identify underlying patterns and underlying relationships. So if we say there are many variables, how do they relate to each other, right? How does one variable relate to another variable? How is the variation in one variable related to the variation in another variable or in another set of variables? Once again, I'm not getting into depth here because this is all about a model-based approach to statistics, and we'll be talking a lot about this throughout the course. And finally, of course, we want to talk about critical thinking, and essentially what we are saying is we want to use data to drive our beliefs, right? So we believe various things, but we don't want to believe them without a foundation in evidence, and that evidence is really data, right? So that's what statistics is all about, evidence-based decision making, and our evidence is data. So what is statistical thinking, or what are we going to learn in this course? We're going to learn concepts, techniques, and habits of thinking. Okay, so the course is really going to communicate to you several concepts, techniques, and habits of thinking. And what are we going to use all of these things for? To study patterns in variation in data, right? So we said statistics is really the study of variation, but it's not just say, okay, let's study variation. We give you in this course a certain set of concepts, techniques, and certain habits of thinking, and you will see the habits of thinking as we go forward, which all help us to take a data set and delve into it to identify patterns in variation. And what do these patterns in variation help us to do? Well, they help us to establish appropriate levels of belief in hypotheses, right? So we see certain patterns. Okay, for example, suppose one of the patterns we may see is that taller people also weigh more in general. Okay, that's a pattern. Similarly, of course, that's a pattern which we understand is very meaningful, and we will probably be correct in believing it because we see this in day-to-day life. But there are other patterns that we may see in data which may not be as obvious as this, right? So just because we are seeing a pattern doesn't mean that the pattern is widely applicable. Okay, so what we want to do is to be able to establish appropriate levels of belief in whatever patterns we observe, right? So we may be able to say, I see this pattern, but I'm not very confident about this pattern. Again, we'll be much more precise when we go forward. On the other hand, we may see some other pattern and we may be able to say with great confidence, yeah, this pattern is really, really solid, and I don't expect that if I try the same thing 100 times, I'll see anything different most of the time. Okay, so what we're going to do is to study patterns, but also be able to establish the level of confidence with which we may believe the pattern. right? So this is really the summary of what we are going to study in this course. We're going to study many concepts, technique, and habits of thinking, but all of them are geared towards this.